Hello, in this video we're going to discuss what it takes to become a professional educator. So you might often hear other people in society say that anyone can be a teacher, anyone can read and follow a lesson plan, anyone can teach basic reading, basic spelling. It's basically like babysitting or vacation Bible school. And if you pass school, then surely you can teach it yourself. And the reality is quite different than that. Not only are you reading the lesson plans, you're actually creating them and having to adjust them based upon the needs of your students. And you just don't have to know something. You have to be able to teach it to those who learn differently than you do, who have different experiences than you do, different backgrounds. Also, there's so much more rigor and expectation in public schools than there is in babysitting or vacation Bible school. Teachers are held accountable for what students are learning, which isn't always the case in other settings. And remember that teachers have lots of responsibilities outside of the regular classroom in terms of clubs, in terms of parent teacher conferences. So the society and teacher viewpoint of what teaching and education is can be quite different. As a teacher, you're expected to do these things. You need to know the content itself. So, the actual high school content, the history, the math, the science, you have to know the content itself. You also have to have knowledge of teaching strategies. And you have to know different ways to teach a concept using different multiple intelligences. You have to understand different abilities and disabilities that students have and how that affects students' learning. You also have to be able to help the students make that connection and apply that concept, the teaching content that you're instructing, to be able to apply that outside of the school setting. You also have to be able to keep the students' interest. I mean, in a way, you are a bit of an entertainer. You have to keep the students' interest in the content and strategies that you're using. And you have to make sure that what you're doing is ethical and kind of instill a sense of that in your students as well. Now, the general consensus is you don't learn to become a great, effective teacher overnight. You may have a gift for teaching, but oftentimes you go through training and protocols to ensure that you are teaching legally and that you have all the necessary toolkit, if you will, to be an effective teacher. In order to become a teacher in Georgia, you must complete two things. You must have a bachelor's degree in a related education field. Usually that's early childhood, special education, middle grades, high school, those type things. You also want to pass the Associated Teaching Certification exam, which right now it is the GACE, which is in Georgia, but in years past it's been called the Praxis or other types of exams. Now, some caveats to that. In most states, you have to take an entrance exam to be able to start the junior senior program, which is a GACE exam as well. So you take one going into the program and take one going out of the program. Often you have to complete ethics exams or courses. In Georgia, you complete one going into the program and one leaving the program. Now, in some situations, some people are often allowed to teach with a bachelor's degree but not having a degree in education. It might be a bachelor's degree in political science or a bachelor's degree in English or something like that. And they are allowed to become teachers, but then they complete coursework to gain their certification. And that's called a TAP program that they complete. So they have a bachelor's degree, it's just not in education. They begin to teach, but as they're teaching, they gain their certification. If you're going to be a middle school teacher, usually you pick two majors or sub areas that you focus on. You can also add on certifications later via taking exams or getting upper level degrees. So it might be that you start out and get your degree in elementary education. You get your initial certification in elementary education. Later, you decide you want to teach high school. You can actually go and take the exam for high school biology for the GACE exam, and if you pass that, you can actually become a you can gain certification to teach high school biology. You might also have a degree, your bachelor degree in elementary education, and then decide I want to teach high school biology and then get a master's degree in secondary biology, which would give you the ability to teach that. So you can move around in terms of the grade level and subject areas you can teach as well. Sometimes you'll also see that secondary majors, so those who want to teach high school, have a degree in their field, such as biology, chemistry, English, that type of thing, and then they go on to get a master's in education, and that's where they get their initial certification. So from this, you'll see that there are multiple ways to complete those requirements in order to become a professional teacher. You'll see that most states have a tiered licensing system so that teachers initially get initial certification before they begin student teaching, and then they earn their full certification a couple years after they graduate. And so, based upon that, you work towards getting a full certification based upon your work in the student teaching classroom as well as your positive evaluations. Now, after you receive your certification, oftentimes teachers are required to earn PLUs or professional learning units to renew their certification, and that usually happens every 5 years. You can earn professional learning units or PLUs by doing teacher workshops, taking college classes, perhaps if you're seeking a higher degree, participating in staff meetings, those types of things. Many teachers choose to gain advanced degrees, such as a master's, specialist, or even doctoral degrees in the field of education. They can choose to do it on the same path, so the same content area, or they might choose to break out of the classroom and earn degrees in other areas like media science to be a librarian, instructional technology to work with the technology, counseling to maybe be a high school counselor or a school level counselor, school psychology, leadership in order to become a principal, those type things. So a point to really focus on here is that you don't have to be stuck in the classroom. You can become a teacher, teach for a couple years, get advanced degrees, and move on to other opportunities in education if you like. You'll find that there are different phases related to becoming a teacher. Often, right now, you guys are in the pre training phase, which is before you begin formal education classes. You're doing your pre work. And this is the experiences you have right now are based upon your prior learning experiences. So, if your parents are teachers, you've worked in a school, of course, you've been through school, so you kind of have some idea as to the structure of education. Then you begin your formal preparation, which is what you're probably in the process of doing now where you take courses related to your degree. So you'll have content level courses, math, science, those type things, where you learn the content of what you're teaching. You'll also have methods classes. This is where you learn how to teach math, how to teach science. That focuses on the different strategies of how to approach learning. And then you have your professional education courses, such as your education classes, your practicums, your field experiences, and your student teaching, which is where you go out into the field and practice teaching students, putting your content and methods classes to the test. Then you become a certified teacher and you're in your induction years. These are the first couple of years of teaching. You're not an expert yet, but you're working on it. Oftentimes, you are put in contact with a mentor teacher that kind of is usually a veteran teacher that helps you along. You'll probably be involved in professional learning workshops. You'll be asked to do lots of reflection activities to reflect on your teaching practices, and you might even be asked to do more observations in other people's classrooms. Even after you become a licensed teacher and you pass your induction levels, you still will have continued growth. So you'll still be doing what's called in-service, which is helping inside of the school district, where maybe you help in and you give professional development in your own right. Maybe you focus on a certain area, you become an expert in a certain area, and you would like to give in-service training to your other teachers. Also, you might continue in your educational pursuits by completing college courses or advanced degrees or even involving yourself in professional groups, researches, publications, and workshops. Does professional learning matter? Yes. So here's a quote that current American teachers spend an average of 14 to 16 hours engaged in faculty development. In contrast, teachers in academically achieving countries spend at least 100 hours annually in faculty development activities. And these don't have to be formal training things. With the emergence of technology, you can participate in webinars, in online activities, read online books, those type things to get your own professional learning without having it to be a formal course or something you really have to pay for. In addition, something you want to be familiar with is the professional ethics or the code of ethics for educators. This is a set of 10 ethical standards that teachers must abide by. They're not always the same as state and federal laws. Oftentimes, you'll find they're a little bit stricter. And it's something that you want to be aware of, because if you break any of these 10 standards, you could get into pretty big trouble with the Professional Standards Commission, which is what holds your certification. If it's bad enough, they can actually pull your certification to where you are no longer a licensed teacher in Georgia. Keep in mind that what is ethical and what is right to do isn't always the same thing. So you have to be a little bit careful in when you make decisions. You might think, I would like to do this. I feel like this is the right thing to do, but it isn't necessarily always the most ethical thing to do. And so, a couple of things that you want to focus on in the realm of ethics are your interaction and association with teachers, your interaction and associates with parents and other teachers, and then your professional duties and responsibilities. So most of the time when we think about relationships with students, we think about child abuse, child neglect, those type things. So of course you want to be aware of those, but you also want to be a good role model in making decisions that are appropriate, and don't let them see you doing immoral or unethical things. In terms of professional responsibilities, of course, you know not to come to school intoxicated, using illegal drugs, those type things. But you also want to hold up your other duties as a teacher in terms of coming to class prepared, knowing your content, calling for a sub when you know that you're going to be out, and not breaking your contract. So those are other ethical things that you want to be cognizant of, which aren't necessarily as severe as what we might think of, but those are still important nonetheless. It's very important that you want to be aware of social media and how that can affect you as a teacher. You want to be careful about friending or liking or sharing your social media with students or their parents. It can be a double edged sword. You might have a problem with what they're posting, or they might have a problem with what you're posting. So, in terms of you having a problem with what they're posting, remember that you are a mandated reporter. So, if you see something that is going, or you hear about something that is potentially abuse or neglect, you have to report it. And so, again, if you are friends with with the students and with the parents, you are responsible for what is said on their social media in terms of reporting it if it is inappropriate. The suggested avenue is to make your social media channels private and be very take takes careful consideration as to who you friend and what you post. Oftentimes, teachers do have their own Facebook or their own Instagram or whatnot for their classroom. And in that case, you might want to make a separate account for that particular reason and have your private and your classroom accounts separate. Also, you want to avoid putting pictures of your students on your social media accounts unless you have written permission from the students and the parents. And oftentimes, this is a sheet of paper, it's a contract that is written and given to the students at the beginning of the semester, and their parents and the students sign it, basically giving permission for their images to be used. But until you have that, you want to be very careful about posting pictures of those students on your personal social media accounts. In terms of your relationship with parents and other teachers, you obviously want to be very respectful when you are encountering them. If there is something that needs to be addressed about the student, maybe not do it in front of the student, maybe have a private conversation with the teacher, have a private conversation with the parent. You definitely don't want to discuss a student's behavior or academic progress in front of other students. Also, keep in mind that you are a mandated reporter. So, if you hear of something or if you see of something that might be inappropriate, harmful from the parent, harmful from the student, harmful from another teacher, you do have to report it, and you want to do so immediately. Now, it might be that it turns out to be nothing, and that is fine. You're not held responsible for it. You cannot get in trouble for making a report that turns out to be not an issue. A word of advice is if a student does start to confide in you about issues that are related to abuse, neglect, self-harm, those type things, you want to involve the principal or the counselor immediately. And then that way, that will help them kind of be on the responsible end. That way, if it does end up going to court, you're not necessarily as involved in that case. Now, remember that the student may come to you and say, listen, I want this to be private between us. You're not allowed to do that. You are a mandated reporter. You do have to report that. You're not allowed to keep secrets for the students in that regard. So the next conversation is who controls education. So we kind of have a pendulum. One is on the state and federal powers, which is very top heavy, and then the other pendulum is local district powers, so bottom heavy. And you'll see education shift back and forth based upon this. At some points, it'll be very federal and state heavy, where the tops are really in charge of everything and pretty much control everything. And then at some point, you'll see the pendulum swing back, and the local districts are more in charge. The individual schools have more of a say. Now, this can be a can cause a large debate in public education. Many people believe that, and this is true in some cases, that those that are making the decisions at the state and federal level aren't always actual educators or haven't been educators recently. And so that is an issue that often people have when the federal and state governments are in charge of education. There's often the concern as to are these conversations being had for political gain or for marketing or in partnerships with companies rather than what is for the good of the student. And oftentimes teachers somewhat feel helpless in this regard. They're told what they're going to teach, they're told all these policies and procedures, and they really don't have a say so. Oftentimes, you'll hear teachers say, my hands are tied, in the regard of they know what decisions need to be made for their students, but they're not able to because of the political red tape. And that can cause some upset among teachers. Also, sometimes teachers get a little disgruntled when parents are coming to these situations and they're, writing letters, making comments, saying that, the teacher isn't doing X, Y, and Z because of their viewpoint on how education works. Um, However, we know as teachers that we don't have control over those particular aspects. So that can also be disheartening from a teacher's perspective. And so, again, what you see is kind of the pinning of society's view of education as well as what education actually is, which, as you complete these courses and as you involve yourself more with education, you're going to see of the differences between those. So, typically speaking, in the past, the majority of the decisions and funding for public education came from the state. What we're seeing now is more of federal standardization to unify the entire nation. And so you're seeing more federal policies coming out for the entire nation rather than just for the state. Regardless, you're seeing less and less powers be available to the local governments or to the local school systems. Now, the say that the public does have in the school system is made based upon the local school board, which is a group of elected officials that make the decisions about the district's education. So each district would have one. Now, this is how the public gets a say. They get to vote on who the local school board is, and those local school board members have a say in what happens at the district level. Interestingly enough, only 10 to 15% of eligible voters turn out to vote for those school board elections. And again, that is how the public has a say in what happens in that particular school system. So let's talk a little bit more about the state, the federal, and the local level governments for education. So at the state level, you have the governor, the state board of education, the Department of Education, and the state superintendent. You'll find their contact information and learn more about them at the official Department of Education of Georgia website. So at the state level, they pass educational policies and laws. They provide funding for education. They often have the largest budget in terms of what is able to be given to individual schools. They can establish charter schools. They have some ability to adopt curriculum, but again, that's going more towards the federal level. They can determine the standardized tests, but again, that is going more towards the federal level now. They can do teacher evaluation measures. Often that is put forth by the federal level and adopted and maybe tweaked a little bit at the state level. The state also provides the certification. That is why you have a Georgia teacher certification. It's at the state level. They also determine what the credentials are for becoming a teacher. So again, who has, is it a bachelor degree? Is it a certification exam? What those credentials are going to be. And again, they can be different state to state because each state is making up their own. They also determine the eligibility for the movement of teachers to the state. So it might be that if you taught in Texas and you're moving to Georgia, the requirements might not be the same because Texas has decided on what those credentials are going to be for their teachers, while Georgia might have something different. So at the local and state district, you have the local superintendent, the local school board, the principals, the central office, the school staff, and the teachers, which are probably the ones that you're most familiar with, having been a student and having some connection to the school system. So at the local district level, that is where they're responsible for hiring the teachers, purchasing the school supplies, figuring out the transportation, the maintenance of the schools, determining attendance policies, the school schedule, the dress code, and behavioral plans. So, as you probably know, if you have moved from one district to the next, or if you know students who go to one district and then maybe your children go to another one, you'll notice that they'll have different schedules, different dress codes, different behavior plans, different attendance policies. And again, it's because all of those decisions are made on the local or district level. Now, having said that, keep in mind that the local district's policies can be trumped by the state. So it might be that the local district has this policy in place and the state says, no, all schools are going to do this in unison. Then the local district would have to change those policies because the state policies and procedures are going to trump any individual local or districts. So, talking a little bit more about the local levels of government in the school system, we have the local school board. They are elected by the public, and so again, you want to make sure to vote for your local school board representatives. They're the ones that actually do the hiring and firing of teachers. Often, what happens is the principal decides they want to hire a teacher, want to fire a teacher, or whatnot, and they recommend it to the local school board, and the local school board is actually the one that makes that decision. Often, these are volunteer positions, so they're not local school board is often not paid. The representatives there are not paid. Oftentimes they're not employed by the school because that would be a conflict of interest. They do have a role in determining who the superintendent will be. They help in the budget development as well as the graduation requirements. So, in conjunction with the school board, you have the superintendent, and this is designed to work sort of like a checks and balances system to where no one power has complete say over what happens in the school systems. So, the superintendent is often the figurehead, the leader. He advises the school board or works with the school board. He or she helps to establish the priorities for the school system, and they have a really high turnover. So, 71% in uh, 71% of superintendents leave within 3 years within the state of California. So this often is a high stress position because you are in charge of quite a bit. In addition, you have central office staff that work at the district level. So people like human resources, special education coordinators, technology coordinators, the business office, nutrition and transportation. And again, they're working on things that affect the entire district. So all the schools in that one district. Then, of course, you have the principals at each school. They usually begin as teachers. They are kind of the liaison between the teacher, the principal, and the superintendent. They do the evaluations of teachers. Oftentimes, they do have to have leadership credentials, and so that they will have a master's or specialist in the area of leadership. Often, they deal a lot with discipline. So, you'll see assistant principals often are responsible for the discipline within the school. You'll also have sometimes in high school department heads who work as mentors who help with the extra paperwork and grants. They may not teach as much, but they also might help with evaluations and professional development for teachers. You also have the support staff, which are often called classified staff that work in the school system. Those are the head secretaries, the bookkeepers, bus drivers, nurses, custodians, cafeteria workers, and parapros. You also have intermediate staff, and this is often at the larger level, which is where you might have a vocational elective teachers, special needs services that are outside of the school system that they service out, alternative schools to where if a student doesn't attend a regular school, they have an alternative school that's in the district, as well as the RESA, which is RESAs are known as resources for teachers. So they provide professional development, subject matter specialists, those type things for the teachers in that district. Now let's talk a little bit about the federal level. So traditionally speaking, the federal level didn't have much control over education. Pretty much it was put in the state's hands. But you're seeing this changing a little bit to where the federal government is having a little bit more say so in the curriculum and in policies. A lot of this is done so that there is unification in the nation in terms of what is taught and what policies schools are using. What you've seen happen more recently is to where federal government is giving states extra money based upon certain stipulations. So in the past, there was something called Race to the Top, to where federal government gave states money if the state promised to use their standardized assessment to make decisions about their teachers and students. So the goal was to help fix lower performing schools, but there was an exchange. We'll give you money if you use our standardized assessment, use our curriculum, that kind of thing. And so that is an overview of the qualifications and the process of becoming a professional educator, as well as where a teacher role fits within the larger scheme of education.